The text arrived at 3:07 a.m., and my phone lit the ceiling like lightning. Lena said, "Are you awake, Ethan?" The screen answered with his name and a bubble that read, "We need to talk." My chest went hollow, and the rain leaned against the window like a witness. Lena said, "Call me now." The call rang once, then died like a match in wind. A week ago he whispered into the receiver, soft as prayer. Ethan said forever. I pressed the word against my ear like a bandage. Lena said, "Say it again." He laughed, and the laugh felt warm like a lamp in winter. Now the room was a cold hotel where no one checked in. Lena said, "If this is a joke, tell me the punchline." The typing dots blinked and vanished. My thumb hovered over the last photo we took, a blur of subway lights and his grin. Lena said, "I kept your promise with both hands." The promise slipped like soap. A siren passed, and the glow on the wall went blood red. Lena said, "If you love me, answer." The voicemail icon waited like a door I feared to open. Morning found the message still glowing, a bruise that would not fade. Lena said, "You do not end a promise with a bubble." I carried the phone to the sink and let the faucet roar over the silence. The voicemail waited like a dare. Ethan said forever, in a recording that smelled like last week and cinnamon toast. Lena said, "You made me believe." I scrubbed a coffee mug that did not need scrubbing. The apartment felt borrowed from a stranger with fewer hopes. Nora said, "Eat something. I am on my way." And her text landed like a hand on my shoulder. Lena said, "Tell me what to do." The typing dots fluttered and failed again. The rain slowed, and the street looked tired, like a party after the lights came up. I set the phone on the table as if it could break the wood. Lena said, "I will not beg," but the vow tasted like a lie. A voicemail from my mother blinked, stern as a clock. Margaret said, "Call me. We need to discuss rent," and guilt pushed between my ribs. I stared at the door as if Ethan might walk through it from another time zone. Lena said, "Tell me this is a misunderstanding." The silence kept perfect time. A week earlier, the city purred, and the night wrapped itself around my shoulders like a shawl. Lena said, "I hate this ocean," and the phone made his breath sound near. Ethan said, "I booked the ticket for June," and my heart leaped like a fish. Lena said, "Prove it," and he sent a screenshot that glittered like a medal. We talked about cheap seats and bad coffee, and the hug that would end the drought. Ethan said forever, so softly, I almost missed it. Lena said, "Say it twice so the walls remember," and he did, laughing at himself. He told me about late meetings and a new coworker who loved rooftop bars. Lena said, "Do not fall in love with the skyline without me." He promised he would wait. I pressed the phone to my cheek, warming a place that had been winter for months. Ethan said soon, and the word felt like a key. I traced routes on a cheap map, apartment to airport to arrivals. Lena said, "I will count the sleeps," and he counted with me until we both ran out. I fell asleep with the call timer running, as if numbers could guard our vow. The algorithm betrayed me at noon with a tagged photo I did not ask to see. Lena said, "I was not looking for you," but there he was, a rooftop, a skyline, a stranger at his side. Sienna said, "Best launch night," in a caption with champagne and star emoji. Ethan said, "Proud of this team," and my stomach folded like paper. Lena said, "Who is she?" and the question snagged every breath. Nora said, "Do not borrow pain," but the comments painted a story that did not need me. I zoomed until pixels broke, hunting for the hand that might be his on her shoulder. Lena said, "You promised me June," and the month turned into a cliff. Another photo loaded, the two of them laughing at a wind I could not feel. Ethan said, "Call you later," in our chat from yesterday, and the promise soured. My thumbs typed, then deleted, sentences that tasted like salt. Lena said, "Tell me this is nothing," but the rooftop kept shining like a dare. I locked the screen, then unlocked it, as if the truth might change between blinks. Dusk gathered like rumor, and the message still sat unread. Lena said, "One more call," then I let the night win, and the ringback tone thinned into quiet. The voicemail box was full, stuffed with ghosts of better days. Ethan said, "Leave it, I will ping you," in a memory that now felt rented. Lena said, "I am here," and even the room seemed to look away. Nora said, "I am outside," and I lied that I was fine with a throat that burned. The kettle clicked off, and the silence after was a canyon. Lena said, "Tell me to stay," and the plea scorched my pride. I typed, then I deleted, then I typed again because hope survives bad weather. Ethan said, "Forever," in my ear from last week, and the echo felt counterfeit. Lena said, "If forever is real, answer now," and the second hand bought. I set the phone face down, as if darkness could teach it manners. A siren drifted by and faded, like a promise that could not find its way back. Lena said, "I will not call again tonight," but the lie tasted metallic. The streetlights blinked on, and the room admitted how empty it had been all day. I pictured the airport gate we had named after a dream, and felt foolish and small. The morning after the red siren shadows, I gathered proof that love had a spine. Lena said, "I built a life around a ringtone," and the sink hissed in agreement. I stacked pay stubs like sandbags against the flood. Ethan said, "You will not have to wait forever," and the promise warmed my palms. I kept a jar labeled June, and fed it singles like a shy animal. Lena said, "I can learn to live inside a countdown." I set alarms for his sunsets and my dawns, and met him in the overlap. Ethan said, "Sleep, I will watch the night for you," and I believed it. I turned down trips and promotions, and rooftop weekends that smelled like new jokes. Lena said, "Love is a shift you clock into," and the words tasted like black coffee. I learned airport codes as if they were prayers. Ethan said, "Your patience makes time my accomplice," and the line felt true. I traded noise for quiet and quiet for waiting. Lena said, "Tell me the cost and I will pay it." I wrote him letters I never mailed because the phone felt faster than hope. The city moved on and I held my breath, because mercy sometimes arrives late. Nora found me at the corner cafe where the barista knew my silences. Nora said, "I brought carbs and blunt honesty," and slid a paper bag across the table. I let the heat fog my glasses like a small mercy. Lena said, "Tell me I am not a fool." Nora said, "You are brave, and bravery looks foolish from the cheap seats." I told her about nights when his breath steadied my storms. Ethan said, "We are a bridge no river can break," and the line rang like a hymn. Nora said, "Bridges still need maintenance," and she pointed at the cracks. I showed her the ticket screenshot that glimmered like a lighthouse. Nora said, "He has to meet you halfway, not in hashtags." I laughed because crying would stain the table. Lena said, "I can hold this longer." Nora said, "Then eat and write down what you need." I wrote sleep, respect, time, proof, while my hand shook. Ethan said, "Soon in my memory," and the word felt like a coin I kept flipping. Nora said, "Let the coin land, then choose yourself." The door chimed, and the cold followed someone in, and I wrapped my fingers around the cup. Home felt narrower than usual when my mother called during lunch. Margaret said, "You cannot mortgage your 20s to a dial tone," and her voice clicked like a metronome. I stared at the plant bending toward the light. Lena said, "I am not abandoning myself." Margaret said, "You are making your heart small to fit his schedule." I explained the plans, the June jar, the alarms like train timetables. Ethan said, "We will nail the distance to the wall," and the old hope rose like a reflex. Margaret said, "Hope is not a budget line," and the air thinned. I told her I was building a future with the tools I had. Margaret said, "You have more tools than waiting." The words pried at my ribs. Lena said, "I am not naive, I am invested." Margaret sighed and asked about rent and groceries like love was a receipt. I promised I was fine, and the promise felt borrowed. Ethan said, "Trust me," in a memory that still glowed. Margaret said, "Trust yourself first," and the line went quiet. I watched dust spin in a sunbeam, and felt both seen and cornered. The first goodbye still pulsed like a bruise I kept touching. We stood under airport skylights that made everyone look holy and hurried. Lena said, "Text me on takeoff, and when you land, and in between," and I tried to memorize his smell. Ethan said, "I will call from the gate, so the distance starts with a voice." We rated snacks and seats, and the odds that love could outstare time. Lena said, "I will build rituals so the weeks behave." He tucked a note into my palm like a secret battery. Ethan said, "If it gets dark, use this," and I nodded as if storms obeyed paper. I watched the security line eat his outline. Lena said, "Turn around once more," and he did, and it stitched something back together. He waved with both hands, embarrassed and earnest. Ethan said, "Forever," and people nearby smiled without knowing why. I walked out into weather that could not decide on rain. Lena said, "This is a test I plan to pass," and the city opened its complicating arms. Night returned like a tide that knew my address. I lined up tiny affirmations on the sill where the city lights blinked like wishful eyes. Lena said, "I am not only the waiting, I am the wanting that works." I wrote a list, labeled proof, and left space for check marks. Ethan said, "You deserve loud love," and the memory clapped once in the dark. I scheduled calls, then backups for the backups. Nora said, "Anchor yourself to things that answer back," and I watered the plant until it stood straighter. I taped the ticket screenshot beside the mirror like a shield. Lena said, "He will come, and I will meet him standing tall." I put coins in the jar and shook it once to hear the future rattle. Ethan said, "Soon," and the word hurt less when I repeated it to the glass. I folded the unsent letters and stacked them like a small altar. Lena said, "If tomorrow breaks me, I will still count myself." The room breathed, and I breathed with it, and the night finally blinked first. The days slipped sharp, and silence grew teeth that gnawed through the promise. Lena said, "I text you at dawn and dusk, but the gaps are louder than replies." The phone hummed with other people's laughter from posts I never asked to see. Ethan said, "Work has swallowed me," and the words felt like a screen too dim to light a room. I kept setting alarms that mocked me with their unanswered rings. Lena said, "Am I chasing echoes?" I studied receipts from dinners that had one seat filled. Nora said, "Your heart should not be standing alone at the table every night." I scrolled back to our subway photo and pressed it like a bruise. Ethan said, "Trust me," but the trust felt like wet paper tearing under rain. The world kept moving, and I held still like a forgotten statue. Lena said, "I gave you my patience, but now it feels stolen." My stomach clenched when his name lit up hours late, and my reply felt less like love and more like begging. Noon found me scrolling faster than thought, hunting for scraps he left in plain sight. Lena said, "You posted a story I was not in," and jealousy hit like a fever. Ethan said, "It was nothing, just a rooftop," but the rooftop carried another silhouette. My chest burned as if betrayal lived in pixels. "What?" Nora said, "Screens tell half-truths, but half is still a wound." I tapped through frames until my thumb ached. Lena said, "I believed June was ours, not a gallery for strangers." He left a heart on someone else's smile, and I read it as a theft. Ethan said, "You're imagining things," and I wondered when imagination started feeling like evidence. The city outside blinked indifferent, and the traffic mocked my stillness. Lena said, "I am turning into a detective when I just wanted to be loved." The silence after his last reply stretched like barbed wire between us. The distance no longer felt like miles but like a wall stitched into my ribs. Lena said, "Even your silence has a time zone now." I circled birthdays on the calendar like bandages, waiting to be ripped away. Ethan said, "I tried to call but you were asleep, and the excuse soured the morning." I stared at the map on my wall, where strings crossed oceans like fragile veins. Nora said, You deserve someone who shows up on time, not in apologies. I kept answering anyway, desperate for proof that devotion mattered. Lena said, I gave up weekends, he gives me excuses. My friends laughed in bars without me, and the invitations dulled into absence. Ethan said, don't make this bigger than it is, but the words felt like a dismissal stamped with finality. My lungs filled with jealousy and fear instead of air. Lena said, I cannot breathe inside this waiting room. Jealousy sharpened its claws when Sienna's name appeared again. Lena said, why does she always stand next to you? Ethan said, she's just a coworker, but the photos dripped with laughter I had not heard in weeks. Nora said, you are competing with a ghost you built from pixels. I wished the ghost would vanish, but it kept grinning from party shots. Lena said, I can taste the distance on your smile. He wrote back with short bursts that felt like crumbs tossed over an ocean. Ethan said, stop doubting, and my throat ached from swallowing questions. The messages stacked like bricks, building a wall between us. Lena said, I am becoming the jealous girl I swore I'd never be. I deleted, then rewrote, then deleted again, my pride leaking like a cracked faucet. The silence became its own language, heavier than words could match. Lena said, I wait in crowded rooms and feel lonelier than empty ones. I carried my phone like an extra lung, necessary but weak. Ethan said, you worry too much, and the dismissal stung like ice. Nora said, you deserve more than a ghost with signal bars. I stared at the subway crowd where faces blurred, none of them his. Lena said, I keep rehearsing the reunion, but now it feels like a funeral waiting to happen. My hands shook when I typed, erased and typed again, begging for scraps. Ethan said later, and the words slammed the door harder than silence. The train roared past, carrying strangers to someone who waited, and I wondered if I was waiting for nothing. The ground shifted when the secret finally leaked through cracks I had ignored. Lena said, tell me it is not true, as the photo arrived from a mutual friend, uninvited but undeniable. Ethan said, it is complicated, and my chest caved like glass. The picture showed him in candlelight with her, smiles soaked in intimacy, not work. Lena said, you promised June, but June already felt stolen. Nora said, truth cuts but lies rot, and the cut bled faster than I could hide. I replayed his voice saying forever, splicing it with the image of her hand on his arm. Ethan said, it meant nothing, but nothing had a lipstick mark and a timestamp. My walls tilted, and even the air felt crooked. Lena said, you made me small so your secret could be big. The room swayed, and the jar of coins sounded empty when shaken. The betrayal rewrote every late reply, every excuse, every laugh I had believed was mine. The confession unraveled in fragments like torn letters scattered by wind. Ethan said, she needed someone, and I was there, and the words gutted my faith. Lena said, I was there too, in every call, in every wait. Nora said, excuses are built for the guilty, and her voice felt like iron. I tried to breathe, but each inhale came in shards. Ethan said, I still love you, but the syllables tasted borrowed. Lena said, love that cheats is not love. It is hunger dressed as care. I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered, afraid of my own volume. The jar labeled June looked childish now, a piggy bank for a lie. My reflection in the window looked older than yesterday. Ethan said, I cannot undo it, and for the first time I believed him. The timeline of lies unfolded like a map I had never studied. Lena said, how long? Ethan said, a few months, and months felt like lifetimes stolen. My heart cracked into arithmetic, calls unanswered, nights wasted, birthdays missed. Nora said, he was never carrying this weight with you, and I finally saw the truth's shape. Ethan said, it didn't mean I stopped loving you, but his voice shook, betraying itself. Lena said, you loved her with time that belonged to me. Silence sat heavy, as if the walls were ashamed. I thought of the nights I held my phone like a heartbeat, and he was somewhere else holding laughter, not meant for me. Ethan said. I thought I could keep it separate, and the words made me gag. Love was not divisible, it was already broken. Memory turned traitor, replaying each laugh, each late call, now colored by betrayal. Lena said, was she there when you promised me forever? Ethan said, I meant it then, and the word then stabbed deeper than silence. Nora said, forever doesn't expire in a week, and her anger burned on my behalf. I saw his smile on my lock screen, suddenly a mask instead of comfort. Lena said, every sacrifice I made became her shadow's stage. My ribs ached like they had carried weight too long. Ethan said, you don't understand, but I understood more than he realized. I understood I had built a cathedral of waiting, and he had prayed elsewhere. The floor felt like water under my feet. The twist sealed itself with the sharpest truth. He had been two people all along. Ethan said, I can't give you what you want, and the line split in two, past and present collapsing. Lena said, you wanted my devotion without its mirror, and the betrayal became bone deep. Nora said, let him go before he drowns you, and her voice was both mercy and command. I stared at the jar of coins, useless now, a monument to misplaced faith. Ethan said, I never wanted to hurt you, but intentions never fixed wounds. Lena said, you broke the only thing I asked you to guard. The silence afterward was final, not empty, but absolute. My chest ached as if it had been carrying his absence long before I saw the proof. The twist was not just his betrayal, but my refusal to see it sooner. The confrontation erupted like thunder trapped inside a glass jar. Lena said, say it to my face, as the video call loaded with trembling pixels. Ethan said, you're overreacting, and my throat burned with the years I had swallowed. The screen showed his apartment, glowing with a lamp I had never seen, a lamp that whispered she had been there. Lena said, I built my life around a ghost, and the silence stretched cruelly before his sigh. Nora texted, don't let him gaslight your pain, and her words steadied my breath. Ethan said, it was nothing, I swear, but nothing had lipstick and laughter. I leaned closer, seeing the lie written in his downcast eyes. Lena said, I deserve better than recycled promises. His jaw tightened, but his words stumbled like drunks in the street. Ethan said, I still love you, and I laughed, sharp as broken glass. Words collided like fists neither of us wanted to throw, but couldn't hold back. Lena said, every unanswered call was her laughter in your ear. Ethan said, don't make me the villain, and the plea landed hollow. My voice rose, but my hands shook as if my body wanted peace while my soul demanded fire. Nora said, name the betrayal, don't soften it, and I bit down on hesitation. Lena said, you betrayed me with silence, with secrets, with crumbs I mistook for meals. Ethan said, I never meant, but his excuses drowned in my fury. The window rattled from passing traffic, as if the city itself applauded the breaking. I slammed the jar of coins on the table, and the sound cracked the night wide open. Ethan said, don't end us, but we had ended weeks ago, he just hadn't told me. The fight burned hotter, stripping us down to the bones of what we had left. Ethan said, you're impossible to please, and the cruelty masked itself as defense. Lena said, I asked for your honesty, not your perfection. My voice cracked, but the truth inside it stood unshaken. Nora said, this is his guilt talking, not your worth, and her reminder kept my spine upright. Ethan said, I thought I could have both, and the admission stung deeper than denial. Lena said, I am not a backup plan you call love when it's convenient. His lips moved, but I cut through with my anger, each word like glass against his excuses. The screen flickered, our connection breaking just as we did. The storm peaked in one brutal wave, our last words striking like lightning. Lena said, I begged for scraps, and you fed me lies. Ethan said, I wanted to keep you, but the selfishness stung raw. I pressed my forehead to my fists, shaking with rage and heartbreak entwined. Nora said, let him hear your silence, but my fury demanded sound. Lena said forever was your cruelest word, and my sob turned sharp, no longer weakness but a weapon. Ethan said please, but the plea echoed too late. The call timer blinked, seconds dragging like weights, before I pressed end. The silence afterward was louder than his excuses ever were. The breaking point left me hollow. But within the wreckage, I felt something shift. Lena said, I am done begging for crumbs, and the words echoed like a vow I had not rehearsed. Ethan said, don't leave me, but he had left me long before tonight. Nora said, this is your rebirth, and the phrase felt heavy, like a crown of fire. I wiped my cheeks and saw the mirror, and in it a woman who looked bruised but unbroken. Lena said, I loved, and I waited, and now I walk away. His silence lingered, but I no longer feared it. The city hummed outside, alive and indifferent, reminding me life did not pause for heartbreak. Ethan said forever in memory, but forever now belonged to me. The dust settled in silence sharp enough to cut, yet soft enough to cradle me. Lena said, the war is over, though my chest still rattled with aftershocks. Thone lay face down, a dark mirror refusing to speak. Nora said, you did the hardest thing, and her voice slipped through the quiet like balm. Ethan said, we can fix this in a message I didn't open. I let the notification rot unread, proof that I had finally chosen myself. Lena said, I will not water dead flowers anymore. The air smelled different, freer, as though the apartment exhaled with me. My hands trembled, but the tremor carried resolve, not weakness. The June jar sat half empty, but I no longer feared what it meant. It was just coins now, not a shrine to broken promises. I walked the streets with my head unbowed, the city finally mine again. Lena said, I can breathe, as cold air filled my lungs like new fire. Ethan's absence rode on my shoulder but no longer strangled me. Nora said, this is what freedom tastes like, handing me a coffee sweeter than memory. The traffic sang louder than my grief, and even the neon signs felt like invitations. Lena said, I am not the waiting girl anymore. I saw couples holding hands, and instead of jealousy, I felt possibility. The ache remained, but it was a scar beginning to scab. Ethan said, please answer in my mind, but my feet carried me forward. Each step was a rejection of the chains I had worn so long. At home I gathered the remnants of waiting and gave them back to silence. Lena said, this shrine is closed, as I folded the unsent letters into a box. Ethan's name no longer lit the screen. I had silenced it. Nora said, sometimes closure is choosing not to ask for more. My chest hurt, but the hurt felt clean, no longer infected by lies. I taped the box shut and placed it in the closet, out of sight, but not erased. Lena said, I carried him long enough, now I carry myself. The jar of coins clinked as I poured them into my palm, heavy but unholy. They would buy groceries, not a reunion. Ethan said, I miss you, in my memory, but the echo grew fainter each hour. The room glowed with a softer light, as if it too forgave me for staying too long. The call I didn't take became the first choice that truly belonged to me. Ethan said, pick up just one more time. In the ringing silence I refused. Lena said, this is my silence, not yours, and my thumb pressed decline with finality. Nora said, that's power, and the word hummed steady in my veins. My reflection in the dark window no longer looked like prey. I watched the skyline flicker and felt a strange peace slip in. Lena said goodbye, though he would never hear it. The quiet afterward was not empty, but whole, like a room finally cleared of smoke. I sat with myself, and for the first time, it was enough. The ache remained, but it no longer owned me. Lena said, forever is not a gift he can give, it is the strength I claim myself. The echoes of his voice faded like smoke into sky. Nora said, you will love again, but first love yourself, and I believed her for the first time. The city hummed like an ally instead of a rival. I brewed tea not for waiting but for comfort. Ethan said, I'll come back, in the ghost of memory, but I let the ghost drift away. Lena said, I survived, and the words held both pain and triumph. The silence no longer frightened me, it felt like a canvas waiting for color. I closed my eyes, and for once the night did not feel cruel. The days after the storm unfolded with a quiet that felt earned. Lena said, "Silence tastes different when I choose it," and the truth settled into her chest like warm stone. Ethan's messages stacked unanswered, each one lighter than the last. Nora said, "Your healing is louder than his apologies," and I carried those words like a shield. The ache lingered, but it no longer poisoned me. Lena said, "He will not define the chapters I write next." The skyline outside glimmered, not as a rival but as possibility. Ethan said, "I still love you in the memory that tried to haunt." But the memory had lost its teeth. My reflection smiled back from the window, bruised but steady. Lena said, "I am enough without the echo of his voice." The final voicemail came like a ghost, knocking on locked doors. Ethan said, "Please just hear me once more," but I let the words expire in digital limbo. Lena said, "Closure isn't listening to echoes, it's sealing the room they rattle in." Nora said, "You don't need his voice to validate your strength." I replayed my own memory instead, the moment I pressed decline, the moment I chose myself. Ethan's forever sounded hollow now, like a key that no longer fit any lock. Lena said, "My silence is the loudest goodbye I'll ever give." The night air was crisp, and I breathed it like victory. I visited the airport not to wait but to release. Lena said, "This gate doesn't own my hope anymore." I stood where we had said goodbye, the air thick with departures. Ethan said, "I'll return in my memory," but the words evaporated under fluorescent hum. Nora said, "Stand here and reclaim the ground he took," and I did, exhaling the weight of years. I whispered his name once, then let it dissolve into the crowd. Lena said, "This is not his story anymore." The intercom called for flights I didn't care to know, and each name sounded like freedom. I walked away lighter, no longer tethered to a promise undone. Healing didn't arrive in triumph, but in steady breaths. Lena said, "Each day without him is proof I am whole." Ethan said, "I'll change in old echoes, but change belonged to me now." Nora said, "Love should not cost yourself," and her words kept circling my ribs like armor. The city no longer mocked me. It mirrored my resilience. I laughed at the cafe, genuine and unbroken. The sound surprising even me. Lena said, "I am not waiting, I am living." The weight of his absence became room for my own presence. The scar remained, but it gleamed instead of bleeding. The final blow arrived not with his voice, but with my truth. Lena said, "Forever was never his to give, it was mine to claim." I scrolled to our last photo, the subway blur where we smiled like fools. Ethan said, "Soon frozen in pixels, but soon had already died." Nora said, "You survived him, and survival looked beautiful in my reflection." I deleted his number, the screen clearing like sky after storm. Lena said, "And that was the last time his name ever lit up my phone." The words rang final, not bitter but carved, leaving a scar that belonged to me. The night hummed soft, and for once, silence felt like a friend.